Traditionally, the elements of a nuclear deterrent force on both the American and the Soviet side, the Russian side, if you will, have been exempt from attack for the very simple reason that both countries regard an attack with conventional weapons on their nuclear deterrent capacity as equivalent to a nuclear attack and justifying a nuclear response. Both sides take this very seriously. Of course, Ukraine is not part of the SALT agreements, nor is the UK, so they are free, I suppose, mischievously to challenge this exemption. And they've done so, and it's very dangerous.
Hello everybody, this is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking again to Ambassador Chas Freeman, who served as U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense and as U.S. Ambassador to Saudi Arabia in the 1990s. Ambassador Freeman, welcome back to the channel.
I'm glad to be with you, Pascal.
I'm glad we can have another debate. This time we focus on Russia and Ukraine, and especially the current negotiations that are going on. We've just had the second round in Istanbul. We are talking today, June 4th in the morning, your June 3rd in the evening. What do you make out of the status of the peace process negotiations, while there was now this large drone attack by Ukraine on Russia, and Russia is now promising to retaliate? At least Dmitry Medvedev did so. What are your thoughts?
Well, these aren't negotiations, they're meetings. It's progress to have Ukraine talking to Russia. This is a product of President Trump's pressure on Volodymyr Zelensky, who had totally refused to talk to the Russians, in fact, issued a decree banning any negotiations with the Russians. Anyway, they're talking. What came out of this meeting in Istanbul is an exchange of memoranda outlining the positions of the two sides. That makes it apparent that there is absolutely no possibility of a meeting of the minds. Therefore, the meeting was brief. It was an hour and a half or so. I'm glad the Russians went there, notwithstanding the provocation of the attack on their nuclear bomber force, which we can talk about and its implications. But I'm glad they kept their cool and went there. And there was a business-like meeting, and the two sides agreed to exchange the bodies of the dead and some live prisoners who are disabled or female. And they also discussed other issues like the alleged kidnapping of children from the eastern provinces of Ukraine to Russia, which the Russians defend as having rescued those children from a war zone. Anyway, I think they also agreed to continue to meet. That's progress, even though there's no meeting of the minds. And what this meeting in Istanbul makes clear is that the issues before the two sides will be settled on the battlefield, not at the negotiating table. That's not a surprise. I find it really rather strange that people in the West should imagine that in order to negotiate, you must have a ceasefire. This is not normal, and very normal for the parties to a conflict to be talking about how to achieve a ceasefire and peace in the context of peace while the fighting goes on. So that is exactly what is happening here. And I think it is fair to say that the attack on the Russian nuclear deterrent bomber force, which Ukraine conducted, very likely with the assistance of MI6. It's very much a British thing. The British learned particularly during World War II, they actually have a glorious history of support for insurgents and unconventional warfare, going back to the Napoleonic Wars and their support of the Spanish resistance to French occupation. But in World War II, they became very proficient at blowing up bridges, assassinating people, and conducting unconventional military operations. So this has all the earmarks of British covert warfare. Anyway, I think it's very clear that the timing of these attacks on the Russians deep into Russia was intended to provoke the Russians in order to sabotage the possibility of peace at Istanbul, because the British, the French, and others in Europe are not interested in having an end to the war. They want to continue it. And therefore, the possibility that Ukrainians and Russians might actually come to an agreement again, as they had in March of 2022, was rather alarming. So I suspect the timing had to do with that. Fortunately, the Russians kept their cool. I think their leader, Vladimir Putin, has a sound reputation for being very cold-blooded about things, not easily panicking, and reacting with considered judgments rather than sudden decisions. And the Russians went to Istanbul. That's progress. That was good. At least they're talking. That lays the groundwork for something in the future, perhaps. But for the moment, the war will continue with the Russians advancing on the ground and the Ukrainians striking out desperately at targets deep inside Russia or at logistical targets that support the Russian advance. Those attacks will have no impact whatsoever on the progress of the Russians on the ground in Ukraine. And they will, of course, as you indicated, draw a reprisal. Every escalation by the West and Ukraine has been met with a counter-escalation by the Russians. I don't think this will be an exception, but they've taken their time to consider how to respond.
There's many things to go deeper in here, but maybe your assessment on the choice of targets that Ukraine, in this surprise attack, in a way, in a fashion that I think nobody foresaw, especially the Russians didn't foresee that this was possible. But the choice of targets is part of Russia's nuclear triad. It's bombers that can carry even nuclear weapons. What do you make out of this, and how big an escalation or how big a provocation do you perceive this to be?
Well, let's be clear. This was apparently planned a year and a half ago. That means it was planned in the Biden era, probably the Rishi Sunak era in the UK. Zelensky, of course, was the president of Ukraine at that time. It's not clear that, given the adversarial relationship between the Trump administration and its predecessors, and the fact that the Trump administration does not apparently regard itself as continuity within the American governmental system. So Mr. Trump says that the Ukraine war is not his war. Well, it is the war of the United States, of course, a proxy war. But anyway, it's not clear whether he might have known about this. So that's a mystery, and it's not an unimportant one in terms of Russian calculations and responses. But let me make a couple of points about the choice of targets. First of all, the bombers in question are out in the open as part of the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty provisions, which require both sides, the Americans and the Russians, to keep these weapon systems visible to the satellite and other aerial surveillance. So people who say that the Russians stupidly left these aircraft out in the open, I don't know what they're talking about. This is a legal obligation. Second, traditionally, the elements of a nuclear deterrent force on both the American and the Soviet side, the Russian side, if you will, have been exempt from attack for the very simple reason that both countries regard an attack with conventional weapons on their nuclear deterrent capacity as equivalent to a nuclear attack and justifying a nuclear response. Both sides take this very seriously. Of course, Ukraine is not part of the SALT agreements, nor is the UK. So they are free, I suppose, mischievously to challenge this exemption. And they've done so. And it's very dangerous because it illustrates the point that actually, in another context, should be obvious from the so-called Thucydides trap. That is that in the case of the Peloponnesian War, it was the allies of Athens who got Athens into the war. And the allies of major countries, the protectorates, if you will, of those countries, are liabilities in the sense that they may do things that require a response from their patrons, which their patrons would not want to otherwise implement. So the first thing is this is very dangerous in terms of challenging nuclear balance. And in Russian military and nuclear doctrine, it would justify a nuclear response. So far, that has not been the case, and that is very good. Second, this is also a very bad precedent in terms of the methods used. There were trucks constructed with removable sliding roofs, which were then given to Russian contracted drivers to drive across Russia, even into other Siberia, where they were parked, and the roofs then were remotely directed to retract, at which point drones emerged and attacked the bombers. Well, think about it. Can anyone, for example, the United States, which has an enormous amount of truck traffic coming in over the Mexican border, now be confident about what that means? What was done to the Russians can be done to the United States, or to the UK, or to France, or to China, or to any other nuclear power. And so the danger and the risks of a covert action against nuclear forces has just perceptibly gone up very much. And that is another aspect of instability. So I think all in all, the attribution to Ukraine of bold or stunningly imaginative action reflects a lack of concern about the implications of what has just happened, which are very considerable. And fortunately, we've seen so far in the interactions between nuclear powers like India and Pakistan, or the United States and Russia, a great deal of caution. But we now have people in the Gaza context, in both the United States and the UK, arguing for a nuclear bomb being dropped on the Palestinians. So the nuclear allergy, which has protected us from the repeated use of the weapons that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, is clearly eroding or hardly present. This is not good.
No, this is not good at all. You're absolutely right. I want to link this discussion then also with like the negotiations that are going on with Iran. But just before we do that, I was wondering about your views on, the way that the current interactions between the United States, Ukraine, and Russia are being portrayed. I read this morning an article in Russia Today, and even Russia Today talks about the United States as being now frustrated and potentially giving up its role as a mediator in the conflict. And this portrayal of the US as a mediator is present everywhere at the moment. I don't think it can be, it should be understood as this, but how do you look at this link, US, Ukraine, Russia, what's going on?
Well, I think President Trump clearly does want to produce a peace in Ukraine. I also believe that he has a very poor understanding of the Russian requirements for peace. he's inhaled a lot of Western propaganda, which attributes to Russia motives and objectives it doesn't have, and ignores Russian statements that are quite clear about what Russia requires for peace, namely some discussion and some agreement on a revised security architecture for Europe that gives Russia a role in the councils of Europe and reduces its fear of foreign invasion from the West, something which is, has precedence in both the Napoleonic and Hitler era and can't be ignored, and also reassures Western Europeans against their largely hallucinatory view that the Russians want to invade and conquer them. The Russians haven't even been able to advance very far in Ukraine after 3 years. I mean, they've taken 20% of Ukraine. They're about to take more, in my view, but they're hardly in a position to sweep through Europe in a conquest. So both sides need to be a bit more realistic, and particularly Europeans who have no peace plan to present need to think about how to cement their own stability and peace in the future. And how to do so, whether the United States, which appears to want peace and stability in Europe, agrees or not. That is to say, Europeans must develop a European view of peace and stability in Europe, which they haven't formulated yet. So I think there are multiple impediments to progress, not just in the Russia-Ukraine context, but the Israel-Palestine context, the Iran context. And the common element in all of these is the disorderly mind of Donald Trump, who is prone to internalize conspiratorial or fallacious views of foreign realities, to act impulsively on the basis of that, and who presides in Washington over no policy process that is worthy of the name. So we have a situation where his crony, the amateur diplomat, Stephen Witkoff, goes off and, meets with the Iranians or the Russians or the Israelis and Hamas indirectly, and finds reasonable solutions to the problem and the problems that he's dealing with in his own mind, agrees with the Iranians that they can have a minimal level of enrichment for their uranium such that they can maintain nuclear power stations, leaves aside, of course, the research reactor that provides radioactive isotopes for medical purposes. Someone helpfully advised me that that requires a 20% enrichment. I didn't know that. Anyway, he agrees to that, then goes home to Washington and is promptly told to shape up by the Israel lobby and retracts what he's agreed to. So the essence of the negotiating process is that the Americans go in, appear to be reasonable, then they move the goalposts and they're unreasonable, and now the demand is Iran must give up all enrichment, also disarm itself, destroy its ballistic missile force, and sever or reduce its relations with the resistance to Israeli hegemony in the Levant. And similarly, we see in the case of Ukraine with Russia that Mr. Witkoff goes into a meeting with Vladimir Putin. He has no staff at present. He's there by himself. There's no American interpreter to ensure that the way his views are rendered reflects their nuanced purposes. He hears what he hears. He goes back to talk to the president and tells him what he heard. Whether that's accurate or not, no one knows because there's no record of the conversation. And this is a very novel way to conduct diplomacy. And I'd say also in the case of Israel and Palestine, Mr. Witkoff went and negotiated an apparent ceasefire, a truce in 3 stages with Israel and Hamas. The Israelis then repudiated that after stage one. The United States then switched sides and supported Israel. And of course, we have the macabre spectacle now of the United States operating with the Israeli military to produce feeding stations in Gaza, which are frankly bait for the Israeli intelligence services to pick off those they want to pick off, which they're doing. They're sniping at people who are desperate for food who come to these feeding stations. There's supposed to be 4 for 2 million people. There are only 3 operating. The whole thing is a desperate farce, and its leadership is constantly changing because those who get involved with it realize it's a farce and don't want to be part of it. So what we have is a government in Washington which is not very competent at conducting negotiations, quite the contrary, and which is not organized to produce coherent and consistent negotiating positions. So nothing is happening. And this does frustrate Mr. Trump. I think he genuinely wants to solve these problems, but he doesn't know how to do it, and the people he's engaged to do it are learning on the job or incompetent.
But is this because this deep-seated distrust of the Trump administration toward the existing mechanisms, because there is an entire State Department and there is the Pentagon, and there must be capable people inside those structures that could come up with strategies and plans. And Colonel Douglas MacGregor told me, Pascal, there is no strategy. This is all being done on a daily basis.
Right. Well, I think there are still some very competent people in both the institutions you mentioned, the State Department and the Defense Department. I've served in both. I think there's great experience to be drawn on there, but it's not being drawn on. I believe the Trump administration has nominated 42 people as ambassadors. Not one of them is a career diplomat. They're all MAGA political appointees. And the State Department has been gutted by Doge and by the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who now has 4 jobs, none of which he can perform adequately. Secretary of State, Chief Archivist of the United States, Director of the National Security Council, and I've forgotten what the other one is, but head of USAID, which doesn't really exist anymore. So what is happening is the systematic sabotage of the permanent government that supports politicians. And I think, this raises a question. Mr. Trump and his political movement allege that they are they were sabotaged in his first term by the deep state. But I would say 2 things about that. One, there's no evidence that he made any effort to enlist the support of the permanent bureaucracy. He immediately dismissed anything they had to say. And second, he was betrayed not by them so much as by his own appointees, people like John Bolton, who sabotaged the effort to produce peace with North Korea and other initiatives. Nikki Haley, who was his ambassador to the United Nations, but who turned on him and so forth. Once again, he's appointed people of dubious competence and dubious loyalty. The criterion appears to be loyalty to him rather than competence. That is the basis of appointments. But I think both the competence and the loyalty are questionable.
Right. I think so too, especially characters like Pete Hegseth and so on, who belong to this neocon strain of the establishment. But what do you think is the reaction now of the others? Because if we look at this from the side of Russia or also Iran and China and so on, what we see is a highly volatile United States, where it's really hard to even figure out where power lies and where decisions are made. And that was true under the Biden administration, and even under the Trump administration, it continues in a different form. And at the same time, you have a Europe that seems to be out of its mind and still think that, the war with Russia has something to do with like, oh, we must not reward Russia. We must stand for blah, blah, blah. I mean, the whole world now sees that Europe is incapable, but somehow caught in a mental fantasy world. how do you think can Russia, Iran, China, and others approach this, supposing that they have better structured processes?
Well, I'm sorry to say that none of them really want to talk to President Trump. And part of this is his slapdown of Zelensky and Cyril Ramaphosa. Why would you want to go into a session with someone who's going to treat you with the contempt and violent rhetoric that he employed on both those occasions? So we have now the White House saying that they're very hopeful there'll soon be a telephone call between President Trump and General Secretary Xi Jinping of China, President Xi Jinping, and nothing from the Chinese at all. I suspect they're not enthusiastic about that. In my diplomatic career, I spoke with people who were quite mad on occasion. Actually, after I left the career, I met and had a long discussion with the late Colonel Gaddafi in Libya. I spent a lot of time dealing with Jonas Savimbi in Angola when he was afflicted with cerebral malaria and often in a murderous frame of mind. And I have to say that one can't be very enthusiastic about such meetings. One can do them and try to make the best of them, but you have a sort of queasy feeling when you're asked to meet people who are as unpredictable as Donald Trump has clearly shown he is. So I don't see, and I would also argue that, of course, summit meetings are not the way to solve complicated problems. They need to be addressed at lower expert levels and reserved for the ratification of agreements that are reached under the guidance of the leaders of the various parties. We're not there. There is no agreement on anything with any of these parties. The United States continues to propose a ceasefire in Ukraine, despite the fact that the United States is a co-belligerent with Ukraine, and the United States and Ukraine are losing the war. Well, people who are losing wars like ceasefires, that's entirely understandable. They want to hold the losing, but they're not in a position to impose it on the side that is advancing. And as you indicated at the outset, there is a contradiction between being a co-belligerent and being a mediator. And you can't just instantly switch roles in that regard. And we've seen that in the context of both Ukraine-Russian discussions, where the United States wants to mediate, but is still a co-belligerent. And the Russians regard it as such, as do the Ukrainians, hopefully. The Ukrainians obviously like that, the Russians don't. And we've also seen it in the Israel-Palestine context, in which the United States is wholly in bed with Israel, but claims to be a mediator on issues like hostage release, humanitarian assistance to those who are being starved by the Israelis in Gaza, and so forth. So there's a lot of confusion here. This is not clear or traditional or effective statecraft that we're observing. And, it would be nice in this context if Europe, which has a distinguished tradition in statecraft, were to demonstrate that. But instead, what we see from Europe is a rather infantile addiction to warfare, which is all the more ridiculous because Europe doesn't have the capacity to conduct the warfare that it insists it wants. So we do see, I guess I'll end this by saying, I think there's a glimmer of hope in a way. I hate to say this as an American, but seeing Europeans, France, Germany, France and Britain in particular, Spain, working with the Saudis about a promised recognition of a Palestinian state, and that constitutes a declaration of independence by those governments from American tutelage. That's encouraging because the only way we're going to see a resolution of either the European conflict in Ukraine or the one in Gaza is if Europeans exercise independent influence. And I had a conversation with a British friend just recently who noted that the United States had forcefully advised Great Britain, Donald Trump had forcefully advised Keir Starmer not to recognize Palestine. And her comment was, Britain already has a king. It doesn't need another one. That is, and I find, I think we would all be better off if Europeans exercised independent judgment consistent with their very distinguished tradition of statecraft.
Yeah, I do fear that the little bit that's going on is not enough to do this on the larger scale needed. But what do you? There are several interpretations of the reasons for which the Trump administration tries to wind down the war in Ukraine and also find an agreement with Iran. The benign interpretation is that this is a peace administration that actually would like to be peaceful, and the less benign one is one that says, oh no, the United States, especially this camp of the Trump team, would actually just like to refocus on China. And I recently hear more of my Taiwanese friends who tell me, from ambassadors down to people working just in an office, everyday people who tell me we are worried about becoming the next Ukraine, because it seems that we are being readied for that. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think both theses are correct. That is to say, the United States is indeed moving toward an America First policy, which judges foreign affairs by reference to American interests and not by reference to the interest of allies or protected states. And in other words, a very selfish, self-centered approach to world affairs. We're seeing this with regard to all of the issues you mentioned. In the case of Taiwan, Taiwan has had basically a free ride on American ideological support for first anti-communism under Chiang Kai-shek, and more recently democracy in the newly democratic polity on Taiwan. But I think many people in the United States are beginning to focus on the fact that a war over Taiwan would not only destroy Taiwan's democracy and prosperity and have a huge impact on global trade and in technology, given Taiwan's centrality in the in the electronic microchip area, but would also risk a nuclear exchange with a powerful China, and even if it didn't reach that level, would risk defeat in conventional arms in this arena. And also, I think, everyone in the region, there are two countries that are more or less aligned with the United States on the Taiwan issue. One is Japan, the other the Philippines, but neither has volunteered to be actively involved in the defense of Taiwan. So we run scenarios, war games that show that a war over Taiwan would likely cost both China and the United States as much as 2/3 of our navies and air forces. This would destroy the United States as a global power. There are people who are thinking about this, and I think, the original, I've always thought that it was absurd for Taiwan to imagine that it could hold out militarily against the much larger society on the mainland of China. However able it is, the military balance is now decidedly against Taiwan and the United States. And it's uncertain whether the United States would come to Taiwan's aid. But in the meantime, we have been unduly provocative. We agreed there would be no official relations with Taipei, but we have a quasi-embassy with a flag and Marine Guards sitting in Taipei. We agreed there would be no troops on the island. Now we have at least 500, maybe 1,000 troops allegedly engaged in training. That's how we got into Vietnam, by the way. And from the Chinese point of view, this is a tripwire, which guarantees an American intervention. People in the United States are advocating putting prepositioned munitions in Taiwan, thus deepening the commitment to a war with China over it. And finally, of course, we had agreed that we would not have a defense commitment to Taiwan. We would provide it with the weapons it needed to defend itself, but not anything beyond that. And we've had, under Joe Biden, cognitively impaired as he was, we had at least 4 occasions in which he unilaterally, unconstitutionally asserted a defense commitment to Taiwan. So this is a disaster waiting to happen. We're already in the middle of a disaster in West Asia, with the goalpost having moved repeatedly in the negotiations with Iran, to the point where the Iranians are sticking with talks only because, for the same reason that in the 1001 Nights, people wondered when the horse was supposed to be trained to talk, whether it might not actually learn to talk, the emperor might die, something might happen, but let's prolong the process, because as long as it's going on, there's no war. And in the Gaza, Palestine-Israel case, we have the same state of confusion, and really unbelievably awful things happening, with the United States fully complicit with Israel in their conduct, and Israel losing all, Israel gaining a reputation for uncompromising evil and unacceptable behavior internationally. European countries beginning now to question whether they should have the sort of relationship of support they've had with Israelis. Jews internationally seeking to cover from association with Zionist atrocities. And, this is all not good. And we're not addressing it. We just seem to be on some kind of very confused autopilot.
I agree. But do you think that by now, for as horrible as this is, the genocide in Gaza, and I do think it is a genocide, and the heavy-handed, the threats of we will bomb Iran if Iran doesn't agree to our terms, this is of course a breach of the UN Charter of no threats of war and so on. And it's, to me, like, there's more clarity now. Do you also think we are getting to a moment of more clarity where, despite the propaganda that we have seen over the last couple of years, it's now so blatantly obvious that all of what you laid out is happening, that it will change the calculations a little bit, maybe the way that we saw that Saudi Arabia and Iran are trying to have closer relationship, that China is trying to have a positive impact by brokering certain agreements on the areas that are possible. You cannot solve everything, but there are certain things going on that to me suggests that there's a little bit more clarity on what the basic premises are the world works on.
Well, I'd put it differently. I think there's a penetration and revelation of the emptiness of hypocrisy. In the Biden administration, there was a great deal of talk about the so-called rules-bound order, which I think when you looked at it meant pretty much might makes right, rather than deference to rules established by international consensus. That is, rule by a single power in its own interest that made up the rules as it went forward. That's all gone. Now we see directly no pretense at all. It's all might makes right. And that is a kind of progress. And it's certainly producing an alienation of the world's public from the United States and the West. And it's producing a reconsideration, a sort of reflection in Europe that had long been missing. So perhaps that's positive. But the horrors that have produced this are difficult to contemplate. And some of us find it difficult to sleep at night, knowing that our governments are involved in basically constructing Auschwitz on the Mediterranean and saying, well, this is under Israeli management, but we manage the showers where the gas comes out. And by the way, have a slice of pizza on your way to the gas chamber. I mean, this is basically a simile to what is now happening, and it's very hard to live with. It doesn't represent what we in the West were proud to represent, which was the values of the Enlightenment, the creation of international law, the rules-bound order of the United Nations Charter, everything we tried to create after World War II and the era of fascism and militarism in the 1930s has now gone away. And we're in another era in which the military means are the first response to any issue. Diplomacy is an afterthought. And I would say in many respects, diplomacy is spin rather than a serious effort to solve problems. So this is dismaying by any standard. And there we are. I'll make a final comment here, and that is that the United States, of course, is the largest perpetrator of these sins of international management of international relations. But it's not alone. Every Western society now suffers from three difficulties. First, maldistribution of wealth, the growth of a plutocratic class, the financialization of capitalism, the reduction of the deindustrialization of economies. And for the left, this is a matter of great resentment. That is, income distribution is unequal. Plutocrats enjoy political privileges that amount to corruption of the political process. The left is very concerned. The right is not concerned at all. But both the left and right are very concerned about what they see as the incompetence, corruption, fecklessness of government. And no one, either the right or left, has any much expectation at all that the government can do anything useful to address problems. And so both are against the current system. They have no faith in it, left and right. Finally, the right, of course, is agitated over the presence of people of alien cultures and religions in their midst. There's xenophobia, there's racism. There is a sense, which they share with the left, that the political ruling class is indifferent to their demands, that elections take place and that their results are ignored. The elite goes on doing whatever it wants, regardless of popular opinion, and that basically they're treated with contempt rather than with respect. So every Western society seems to be suffering from these ills. This is why you see the results you saw in the elections in Poland, and why you have the confusion in politics in France that you have. And I would say the UK is no exception. I don't know about Switzerland. I hope you're exempt in Switzerland from this, but I doubt it. It's certainly present in German politics. So this kind of constellation of despair in Western societies, disgruntlement, dissatisfaction, leads to the selection of leaders who are not terribly well-versed in statecraft, and policies that are volatile and confusing, and demagoguery in domestic politics that produces the volatility I mentioned. So this is a sad circumstance. And basically, what it says in the end is that the cure to the international disorder and danger lies at home in getting our own political establishments reorganized, reformed, and straightened out, and dealing effectively with the sources of popular discontent, which are real. Wealth is being concentrated at the top and deprived of the poor. The poor are getting poorer, the rich are getting richer. Governments are not paying attention to the requirements, the needs of their populace. And the populace is responding by saying, well, we don't trust you to do much of anything. And with the result that we have governments that are increasingly regarded as illegitimate and that carry out policies that also lack legitimacy.
Yeah, and unfortunately, the European response to the grievances of the general population is to shower more money now on the military complex and on militarization. But unfortunately, it is what it is. Ambassador Freeman, thank you so much for giving us a very broad overview on your thinking on where things are going. You really clarify a lot. People want to read from you, they should go to your homepage, right? I will link to that in the description. Any other place where they should read from you?
No, I'm a freelance retired curmudgeon, and I put together my own website, which means it's a horribly primitive thing. I really don't know what I'm doing, and I admit that.
It's a wonderful homepage, and it carries all of your great, brilliant writings. So I encourage everybody to go and find them there. So because you do also give a lot of talks, and the written form goes to your homepage. So it's a wonderful source.
Well, thank you, Doug. I'm sorry to be so utterly pessimistic about the current situation. But I don't see the cure coming anytime soon.
We are witnessing a live streamed genocide, and as you put it, an Auschwitz on the Mediterranean. This is as horrible as it gets. I mean, this is definitely the worst things in my lifetime in terms of an atrocity, an ongoing one. So it's hard to be positive about this.
You called it a genocide, but you're not alone. The International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, 200 non-governmental organizations, including the most prominent advocates of human rights and the rule of law, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, etc., have all judged that this is a genocide. So the denial that it is genocide is a political crime. And we have to call things what they are if we're to deal with them. And this is a horror of a sort we have not seen since the 1940s.
I agree. Ambassador Freeman, thank you very much for your time today.
Well, thank you.